They say Pennsylvania's small towns are quiet, but that's a lie. Tonight on Vesper Shroud, you'll hear the stories locals refuse to tell, places where something watches from the riverbanks, where abandoned schoolhouses echo with impossible sounds, where tracks in the snow change shape, and where the dead still wave for help on rain-soaked roads. These aren't legends. These are real encounters from towns that want you to forget them. And if you stay until the end, you'll understand why they never speak about what comes next. Story 1. Williamsport River Entity. I caught it on video. I actually filmed something that shouldn't exist, something that breaks every law of nature. And now I'm terrified that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to convince people that what I recorded is real. Or worse, that I'll stop trying. That I'll delete the file and pretend it never happened. That I'll become complicit in the cover-up. My name is Stephen Price. I am a videographer from Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I work freelance for local news stations, shooting features and documentaries about the community. I am a normal guy, college-educated, rational, skeptical, the kind of person who doesn't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena or paranormal activity. Until 3 months ago when I filmed something at the Susquehanna River that completely destroyed my understanding of what is possible. The Susquehanna River runs through Williamsport like the town is lifeblood. It's a beautiful waterway, popular with kayakers and fishermen and people who just want to enjoy nature on a warm afternoon. The river has history. It has been part of this region for thousands of years. Native Americans lived along its banks. Settlers arrived and built their communities here. The river has seen everything this land has to offer. But the river also has something else. A presence. A thing that lives in the deeper water. Something that the longtime residents know about but don't talk about. Something that shows itself occasionally to people unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I first learned about the river entity through conversations with locals. Kayakers would mention strange experiences. Fishermen would talk about seeing things in the water that they couldn't explain. A woman who jogged along the riverbank told me that she had seen something pale and human-shaped rising out of the water before vanishing into the mist. I always dismissed these stories as folklore, urban legends, exaggerations born from the mystery and power of the river itself. But then I started hearing the same story repeated with eerie consistency. A pale woman, rising out of the water, dissolving into mist before anyone could get close. Multiple kayakers had reported this. Multiple fishermen had mentioned it. Multiple people, unconnected to each other, describing the exact same phenomenon in almost identical language. That's when I became curious. That's when I decided to investigate. I drove to the Susquehanna River one evening in late August with my camera equipment. I set up on a small overlook where I had a clear view of the water. The evening was beautiful. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The water was calm. Too calm. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I recorded the river for about an hour, just capturing footage of the water and the landscape. Nothing unusual happened. No pale woman. No mist. No manifestation of anything paranormal. I was starting to feel foolish. I was starting to think that I had wasted an evening chasing a ghost story that had no basis in reality. Then the water changed. It's hard to describe what I witnessed. The surface of the river began to shimmer. Not in the way that water normally moves. This was different. The shimmer was localized to one specific area. A circle of disturbed water about 20 feet in diameter. The water within that circle became darker. Colder somehow. I could feel it from where I was standing. The temperature of the air around that spot dropped so dramatically that I could see my breath, even though it was still summer. My camera was already recording, so I captured what happened next. A shape began to form in the water. At first, it was just a silhouette, a suggestion of form beneath the surface. Then it started to rise, slowly, deliberately, like something was pushing itself up from the deep. And as it rose, I could see details. Pale skin, long hair, a human form that wasn't entirely human. The thing that emerged from the Susquehanna River that evening was a woman. Or something that looked like a woman. Her skin was white, corpse white, death white. Her hair was long and dark and dripping with water. Her eyes were empty, completely black. No iris, no pupil, just black voids where a person's eyes should be. She was wearing something that might have been a dress at one time, but it was so deteriorated that it looked more like rotting fabric hanging from her frame. She turned her head and looked directly at me. I was still 40 feet away, on the overlook, behind my camera. But she was looking at me. I could feel her awareness. I could feel her attention focused on my location with an intensity that was overwhelming. Then she raised one of her arms. The movement was too smooth, too fluid, not the way a human arm moves. The limb extended slowly, unfolding like something that had been compressed was finally being released. The hand at the end of that arm had fingers that were too long, nails that were too sharp, and she was reaching toward me. That is when she started to dissolve. The mist came up from the water like something alive, like something with purpose. It rose around her body and consumed her. She didn't fade gradually. She dissolved into the mist in discrete sections. The hand that had been reaching toward me disappeared first, then the arm, then the body, then the head. Within 20 seconds, she was completely gone. All that remained was mist hanging over the water, mist that smelled like decay and something else, something ancient and wrong. I was shaking so badly that I could barely hold my camera steady. My hands were trembling. My heart was racing. My entire nervous system was screaming at me to run. But I kept the camera recording. Some part of my professional mind kept operating even as the rest of me was in a state of psychological shock. The mist dissipated slowly. It took about 3 minutes for the water to return to normal. The temperature rose. The air became lighter. The sense of dread that had settled over the river gradually lifted. But I remained in a state of complete disorientation. I packed up my equipment in a daze and drove home. I didn't look at the footage that night. I couldn't. I was too frightened, too unsure of what I had actually witnessed. But the next morning, I forced myself to review the recording. What I had captured on video was extraordinary. The footage showed the water beginning to shimmer, the shape rising from beneath the surface, the pale, twisted figure of the woman, and most disturbing of all, the moment when she looked at me. On video, it was clear that she was aware of being filmed, clear that she was conscious, clear that she was aware of my location even though I was hidden on an overlook. I spent 3 days reviewing that footage, analyzing it, looking for any signs of digital manipulation or visual artifacts that might suggest I had somehow created the image myself. But there was nothing. The footage was authentic. It was real. I had actually filmed a paranormal entity rising out of the Susquehanna River. The question was, what do I do with this footage? I considered going to the local news station where I freelance, but I knew how that would be received. I would be laughed out of the building, accused of creating a hoax. My professional credibility would be destroyed, and the station would never air footage that they couldn't explain or understand. I considered going to paranormal investigators, but they seemed like charlatans and grifters, more interested in entertainment than truth. I considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I filmed a ghost? That would result in psychiatric evaluation, not investigation. So I kept the footage to myself. I told no one what I had discovered. I tried to go back to my normal life, but that was impossible. I became obsessed with understanding what I had seen. I started researching the history of the Susquehanna River. I looked into historical records of drownings and deaths associated with the water. I searched for any documentation of paranormal activity connected to the river. What I found was deeply disturbing. Between 1840 and 1960, more than 200 people drowned in the Susquehanna River near Williamsport. Most of these deaths were accidental. People fell out of boats. People went swimming and got caught in undertow. People made mistakes that the river exploited. But there was a pattern that I noticed. These deaths seemed to cluster around certain seasons, certain times of year when the river seemed to claim more victims than others. And more significantly, there were historical accounts of something pale and female rising out of the water. References buried in old newspaper archives. Mentions in local folklore. A woman, rising from the deep, appearing to people before they drowned. One account from 1903 described a fisherman who reported seeing a pale woman rise out of the water and beckon to him. The fisherman resisted the urge to follow her into the water. He left the riverbank and never returned. He lived another 60 years and reportedly refused to ever discuss what he had seen. Another account from 1928 described a group of swimmers who reported seeing a woman in the water. One of them tried to help her. He waded toward her, and then he was pulled under. The other swimmers managed to pull him back out, but he had drowned. His lungs were filled with water. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. He had drowned while above the surface. The doctors couldn't explain how that was possible. I realized that I had filmed something that had been hunting in this river for centuries. Something that lured people to the water. Something that killed them. And something that I had actually looked at. Something that had looked at me. The real horror began about 2 weeks after I filmed the entity. Strange things started happening around me. I would wake up at night with the taste of river water in my mouth. My apartment would smell like decay for no apparent reason. I would have dreams where the pale woman was reaching toward me, her two long fingers extending, her black eyes staring. One night, I found wet footprints in my bedroom, footprints leading from my door to my bed. They weren't there when I went to sleep. They appeared while I was sleeping, and they weren't human footprints. They were too large. The toes were too long. The shape was wrong. I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't leave my apartment, because every time I tried to leave, I would hear the sound of water, the sound of something wet and heavy moving through my rooms. I would see shadows that were shaped wrong. I would feel the presence of something vast and ancient and hungry moving through my living space. I started researching how to contact paranormal experts, real ones, people who claimed they could help with hauntings and entities. What I discovered was worse than I expected. There were people online who claimed they were being haunted by the river entity. People from Williamsport, people who had encountered the pale woman, people who were experiencing the same phenomena I was experiencing. One person wrote that the entity was trying to drown them, that every night she appeared in their bedroom, water pouring from her mouth, her hands reaching for their throat. Another person wrote that they couldn't go near water anymore, that every time they tried to take a shower or fill a glass, the water would turn black and the pale woman's face would appear in the surface. A third person wrote something that terrified me more than anything else. They wrote that the entity didn't just haunt people. It followed them. It waited for them to get near water. And when the moment was right, when they were vulnerable, it would pull them in. That is when I understood. That is when the full horror of my situation became clear. By filming the entity, I had marked myself. I had documented its existence. I had proven that it was real. And it was coming for me. I moved away from Williamsport. I moved to Pittsburgh, but the entity followed. I can feel it. I can hear it in my shower. I can see it reflected in any body of water. I can feel its attention focused on me with relentless intensity. The pale woman is patient. She has been hunting in the Susquehanna River for more than a century. She understands how to wait, how to stalk, how to move slowly closer to her prey. And now I am her prey. I still have the video. I still have the footage of the entity rising out of the water. I could release it. I could share it with the world. I could prove that the paranormal is real. I could warn people about what is living in the Susquehanna River. But I am terrified to do that, because I'm not sure what would happen if I did. Would the entity become angrier? Would it escalate its pursuit of me? Or would it stop, satisfied that its existence had been acknowledged? Would it turn its attention to the millions of people who would see the footage and become obsessed with the river? So I keep the footage private. I keep it on an encrypted drive. I keep it hidden, and every night, I hear the sound of water. Every night, I feel the pale woman getting closer. Every night, I know that eventually, she will find me near a body of water. And when that happens, I will understand what it means to drown while the entire world refuses to believe that what is killing you is real. The Williamsport River entity is real. The paranormal is real. The supernatural is walking among us. I have proof, but the proof has marked me. The proof has made me a target. And the entity is patient. It is waiting. It is coming. And when it finally pulls me under, no one will believe what took me. No one will understand. The video will be dismissed as a hoax. My death will be ruled accidental. And the river will keep hunting. It will keep rising. It will keep taking people, one by one, into its dark waters. I am telling you this because I need someone to know the truth. I need someone to understand that the entity is real, that it is still out there, that it is still hunting, that if you ever see a pale woman rising out of the Susquehanna River, you need to run. You need to get away from the water. You need to understand that some things in nature have been waiting for centuries to claim another victim. The water is calling me now. I can hear it. The pale woman is so close that I can smell the decay on her breath. And I am starting to wonder if resistance is even possible. I am starting to wonder if eventually we all surrender to the river. If eventually all of us who have seen the entity end up in the deep water, pulled down by pale hands with two long fingers. The Susquehanna River is beautiful. It is peaceful. It is part of the landscape of Pennsylvania. But it is also hungry. And it has never stopped feeding. Story 2. Haunted Montrose Schoolhouse. I heard a child crying inside a room that I knew was empty. I had locked that room myself. I had the keys in my pocket. And inside that sealed space, a child was weeping like their heart was breaking. The sound came through the wooden door clear as anything. And when I opened it, There was nothing there but darkness and cold air. That was the moment I understood that Montrose Schoolhouse wasn't haunted. It was hungry. My name is Eleanor. I've been a teacher for 37 years, taught in 5 different schools across Pennsylvania, and I thought I had seen everything that education could throw at me. But in 1999, I took a job at Montrose Elementary School, a building constructed in 1887 that the district had decided to keep open despite its age and the numerous complaints from staff. Within 3 weeks, I understood why the previous principal had resigned. Within 3 months, I understood why nobody stayed at that school longer than a single year. The schoolhouse is still standing. It's a brick structure from the 19th century, built on a hill overlooking the small town of Montrose, Pennsylvania. The building has 3 stories and 32 classrooms, with hallways that twist and turn in ways that seem to make no architectural sense. Staircases appear in unexpected places. Rooms connect to other rooms through doorways that seem unnecessary, and the whole building settles and creaks like something alive, like it's breathing around you. When I first arrived at the beginning of the school year, I thought the building was charming. It had character. The wood floors were original. The walls still held the radiators from the old heating system. The ceilings were high and pressed metal. It felt historic, prestigious, like teaching in this building connected you to generations of educators who had come before. I noticed the sounds within the first week. Desks moving, not randomly, but deliberately, as if someone was arranging them. I would set up my classroom in the morning with the desks arranged in rows for a lesson. I would leave for lunch, and when I came back, the desks would have been moved. Sometimes arranged in a circle, sometimes pushed against the walls. Once, I found them stacked in the center of the room, one on top of another, creating a tottering tower that should have fallen but somehow held together. I told myself that the janitors were moving them. I asked the head custodian, a man named Robert, if he was rearranging furniture after hours. He looked at me like I was crazy. He said he never touched classroom furniture. He said if the desks were moving, it wasn't him doing it. The other teachers mentioned it casually, like it was a known quirk of the building. They said the schoolhouse had always had strange activity, sounds of movement at night, footsteps in hallways that were supposed to be empty, desks and chairs found in different positions than they were left. One teacher, an older woman named Margaret who had worked there for 3 years, told me that the strange activity came and went in cycles. Sometimes the schoolhouse was quiet for weeks. Sometimes it was active every single day. I asked her what she meant by active. She said that the building moved things, that the building rearranged furniture, that it made sounds, that it wanted to be acknowledged. She said the best way to deal with it was to simply accept it and not make a fuss. She said the building had been here much longer than any of us, and it would be here long after we were gone. I didn't believe her. I thought she was exaggerating, or that there was some rational explanation that we hadn't found yet. Maybe it was settling, or maybe someone was pranking us. I decided to stay late one night and see if I could catch whoever was moving my desks. I waited in my locked classroom, sitting in the darkness, watching. The building around me was quiet. The hallways were empty. I could hear the old heating system clanking through the pipes, the occasional creak of wood settling, the distant sound of the wind outside pressing against the windows. I waited for 3 hours, sitting in complete darkness, absolutely certain that I would catch whoever was playing this prank. Instead, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps, coming down the hallway outside my classroom. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the sound of someone walking in a measured pace. The footsteps came closer and closer to my door, and then they stopped directly outside. I could see a shadow under the door, cast by light from somewhere in the hallway, a shadow of someone standing directly in front of my classroom entrance. I held my breath. I was terrified to move, terrified to even make the slightest sound. The shadow stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute. And then, slowly, it moved away. The footsteps resumed, moving back down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness of the building. When I came back the next morning, my desks had been rearranged. They were arranged in a perfect circle, every single one of them, positioned exactly the same distance from the center point, as if someone had taken measurements to get them precisely correct. The arrangement was so perfectly symmetric that it couldn't have been done randomly. It was intentional, it was precise, it was a message. I reported it to the principal, a man named Vernon who seemed perpetually exhausted and unwilling to engage with any problems in the building. He told me that the schoolhouse had a history of unusual activity, that the district was aware of it, that he recommended I simply accept it and move on. He said that if I made a fuss about the haunted schoolhouse, the district would remove me from the position, because they had a strict policy about not publicizing paranormal activity in school buildings. That was when I understood that this wasn't a prank. The administration knew about it. They had been dealing with it for years. They had hired me knowing that the building was actively haunted, and they had never mentioned it. The activity escalated over the next few weeks. The moving desks became a nightly occurrence. I stopped trying to arrange my classroom because I knew it would be rearranged by morning. But other things started happening too. Chalk writing itself on the blackboard, papers shuffling in locked drawers, and most disturbing, sounds coming from inside the building at night. Robert, the custodian, started reporting that he could hear movement throughout the building after hours. He said he would hear footsteps on the stairs, moving back and forth. He said he would hear doors opening and closing, even though all the doors were locked. He said that one night, he heard what sounded like an entire classroom full of children, dozens of them, moving around, talking in whispers, their small voices echoing through the hallways. But when he went to investigate, there was nobody there. Every classroom was empty. Every hallway was deserted. In 1999, Robert decided to do something that would change everything. He set up professional audio recording equipment throughout the building. He positioned microphones in hallways, in empty classrooms, in the stairwells. He wanted to capture the sounds that he was hearing, wanted documentation of the paranormal activity that was occurring in the schoolhouse. He let it record for 1 week, 7 nights of recording, capturing every sound that occurred in the building after the students and staff had gone home. When Robert played back the recordings, what he found was something that no amount of rational explanation could account for. The tapes captured sounds of movement throughout the building, chairs scraping across floors, desks being dragged through hallways, and underneath all of that, a sound that made everyone who heard it go pale. Children, an entire class of children, dozens of them, their small voices whispering together. They weren't speaking clearly enough to understand what they were saying, but the tone was consistent. They sounded frightened. They sounded like they were calling for help. And there was one sound that Robert reported that he found most disturbing. On one of the recordings, captured in a locked classroom on the 2nd floor, there was the sound of a single child crying. Not the normal crying of a child having a bad day. This was the sound of absolute anguish, of a child experiencing the depths of human despair. A sound so raw and honest that Robert said he couldn't listen to the entire recording without feeling physically ill. The recording spread quickly through the school district, and eventually, someone made a copy and gave it to a local news station. By the spring of 1999, the Montrose schoolhouse had become famous. Paranormal investigators were requesting access. Reporters were trying to get statements from the staff. Families were pulling their children out of the school because they were terrified of the haunted building. But the district refused to close the school. They refused to discuss the recordings publicly. They refused to acknowledge that anything unusual was happening. Instead, they fired Robert for creating and distributing recordings without authorization. They transferred the paranormal investigators away from the building, and they continued operating the school as if nothing was wrong. I stayed for the entire year, and during that time, I came to understand the truth about Montrose Schoolhouse. The building wasn't just haunted. It was a location where something terrible had happened, something so traumatic that it had left an indelible mark on the physical space itself. I did research in the local library, going through old newspapers and records. I found references to a fire that had occurred in the schoolhouse in 1952. The fire started in the basement and spread quickly through the wooden structure. 23 children and 2 teachers died in the blaze. Most of them were trapped in locked classrooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors, unable to escape. The investigations afterward determined that a janitor had locked the emergency exits to prevent students from leaving the building during the school day. That custodian survived the fire and was never charged with any crime. The children had burned alive. They had died in terror and pain, trapped in rooms that they couldn't escape from, their screams echoing through the hallways as they were consumed by flames. And somehow, their suffering had been imprinted on the building itself. Somehow, the trauma of that moment had created something that continued to echo through the decades. The desks moved because the children were still trying to rearrange the classroom, still trying to create an escape route that didn't exist. The footsteps were the phantom sounds of teachers and janitors from that day, walking the hallways, trying to reach the children they couldn't. save. And the crying sound that Robert had recorded was the final moments of a child calling out in agony, their voice preserved in the physical matter of the building itself. The school continued to operate for 5 more years after 1999. Despite the recordings, despite the paranormal investigations, despite the families who refused to send their children there, the district continued to staff the building and pretend that nothing was wrong. I left after my contract was up, unable to spend another year in a place that was suffused with such suffering. But I came back once, years later. I couldn't help myself. I drove back to Montrose, back to the schoolhouse, wanting to know if anything had changed. The building was still there, still standing, still looking like a 19th century structure that had been maintained reasonably well. But when I approached the entrance, I felt it immediately, the overwhelming presence of despair, the crushing weight of trauma that had seeped into the very foundations. And I heard it, the crying sound, the sound that Robert had recorded all those years ago. It was still there, still echoing through the building, still calling out from behind locked doors. The voices of children who died in fire, whose final moments of terror had been so intense that they couldn't be erased by time or distance. The school was finally closed in 2004. The district cited budgetary concerns, but everyone knew the real reason. The paranormal activity had become too severe to ignore. Too many teachers had quit. Too many parents had complained. Too many visitors had recorded the sounds of crying children and disembodied footsteps. But the building still stands. The Montrose Schoolhouse is abandoned now, boarded up, off limits to the public. But if you go there at night, if you stand outside the walls, you can hear it. The sound of desks moving, the sound of footsteps pacing endlessly. And if you listen very carefully, you can hear the children. You can hear them crying, calling for help, their voices trapped in the walls, unable to escape, eternally re-experiencing their final moments. I have the recording that Robert made. I've listened to it hundreds of times over the years. And every time I listen to it, I hear something new. A child, his name whispered in the chaos. A teacher, his voice, calling out orders that would never be followed. And underneath all of it, the relentless crying of a child who understood that they were about to die. The paranormal horror of Montrose Schoolhouse ISN, about ghosts or supernatural beings. It's about trauma that is so intense, so overwhelming, that it tears a hole in reality itself. It's about suffering that can be contained by death, that echoes through physical space, that calls out across decades to anyone who will listen. And I know that as long as that building stands, the children will continue to cry. They will continue to move the desks. They will continue to walk the hallways. They will continue to call for help from behind locked doors, their voices preserved in the physical matter of the building, their terror and pain available for anyone who has the courage to listen. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the crying sound. Not from the schoolhouse anymore, but from somewhere closer, from inside my own house, from the walls themselves, and I understand that the trauma doesn't stay in one place. It spreads, it infects, it finds people who have touched it, people who have listened to it, people who have acknowledged its existence. And now I'm infected. The crying of those children follows me. Their voices echo in my ears when I'm alone. Their despair seeps into my dreams. And I know that eventually, someday, I will have to go back to that schoolhouse. I will have to stand before those locked doors and let the children inside call to me. I will have to acknowledge their suffering in a way that nobody else ever has. Because that is what the building wants. That is what the children want. They want to be remembered. They want their suffering to be witnessed. And they will call until someone finally answers, finally opens those locked doors, finally lets them out. Story 3. DuBois Shapeshifter Report. What would you do if you followed tracks in the snow that started as a deer, switched to human footprints halfway through, and then became something that shouldn't exist at all? My name is Marcus Webb. I am a patrol officer with the DuBois City Police Department in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. I've worked this job for 18 years, seen accidents, domestic disputes, drug busts, and every kind of human tragedy you can imagine. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened on the night of January 14th, when a terrified woman called 911 about a distorted animal circling her farmhouse, and I tracked something through the snow that changed shape right before my eyes. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. Linda Hartman, A widow living alone on a rural property 3 miles outside DuBois reported seeing an animal in her yard that looked wrong. Not injured, wrong. The dispatcher tried to get more details, but Linda kept repeating the same phrase over and over. It looks wrong. It moves wrong. Please send someone. I was closest to her location, so I took the call. The roads were covered in fresh snow, maybe 4 inches, with more coming down steadily. Visibility was poor, wind pushing the flakes sideways across my headlights. The kind of night where you drive slow and hope nothing jumps out in front of you. Linda's farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by bare fields and patches of forest. Her porch light was on, casting a yellow glow across the snow-covered yard. I could see her silhouette in the window, watching for my arrival. The moment I pulled up, she came outside, wrapped in a heavy coat, her face pale and tight with fear. She pointed toward the tree line about 50 yards from the house. Told me the animal had been there for almost an hour, pacing back and forth along the edge of the woods. Sometimes it looked like a deer. Sometimes it looked like something else. She tried to get a clear view with binoculars, but every time she focused on it, the creature would move behind trees or shift position, staying just out of clear sight. I grabbed my flashlight and told Linda to wait inside. The snow was still falling, covering any tracks quickly, but I could see a pattern of disturbances near the tree line. I radioed dispatch to let them know I was investigating, then started walking across the yard, my boots crunching through the fresh powder. That's when I found the first tracks. Deer prints, clear and unmistakable. 4 hooves, proper spacing, moving in a straight line from the woods toward the house. I followed them, sweeping my flashlight beam across the snow, expecting to find where the deer had turned and headed back into the forest. But the tracks didn't. They turned back. They continued toward the house, getting closer, and then something impossible happened. The deer prints became human footprints. Not gradually, not mixed together, just changed. One step was a hoof print. The next step was a bare human foot, toes spread wide in the snow. I stopped walking, stood there staring at the tracks, my brain trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This had to be a prank. Someone messing around, trying to scare the old widow. But the snow was fresh and undisturbed except for these tracks. No signs of anyone walking out here with props or tools. Just these prints, transitioning from animal to human in the space of a single stride. I followed the human prints. They circled Linda's house 3 times, staying about 30 feet from the walls, bare feet in snow that should have caused frostbite within minutes. But the stride was wrong. Too long, too evenly spaced, like whatever made these prints wasn't walking normally, wasn't affected by cold or terrain. Then the prints changed again. The human footprints became something else entirely. Larger, deeper, with claw marks at the front. The stride lengthened even more, and the spacing became irregular, like the creature had started loping on all 4s. But the prints themselves didn't match any animal I recognized. They were like a hybrid, mixing human and animal characteristics in ways that violated every rule of biology. My radio crackled, dispatch asking for a status update. I told them I had found unusual tracks and was continuing to investigate. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Inside, my heart was hammering, and every instinct screamed at me to get back in my car and leave. The tracks led away from the house, heading into the woods. I should have called for backup, should have waited for daylight, but I needed to know what I was dealing with, needed to see this thing with my own eyes and confirm I wasn't losing my mind. The forest was dark and silent. My flashlight cut through the falling snow, illuminating trees and shadows and the continued track pattern leading deeper into the wilderness. The prints kept changing, human to animal to something in between. Sometimes they were side by side, like the creature was walking on 2 legs and 4 legs simultaneously. Sometimes they overlapped, like it was shifting forms while in motion. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile when I heard it. A sound that started as a deer, a snort, morphed into something like a human cough, and ended as a growl that belonged to neither species. It came from ahead and to the left, maybe 50 yards away. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. Something large and pale, hunched over, moving with a gait that switched between upright and quadrupedal. In the brief flash of light, I saw skin that looked stretched too tight over a frame that was changing shape, bones shifting under the surface, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. I drew my service weapon, called out standard police identification, ordering the subject to stop and show themselves. The movement stopped. Complete silence except for the wind and my own breathing. I waited, weapon raised, flashlight steady, watching the shadows between those trees. Then it stepped into the light. Not fully, just enough for me to see its outline. It stood on two legs, roughly human-shaped but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, arms hanging too low. The head was elongated, somewhere between human and animal, with what looked like antlers or horns growing from the skull. But as I watched, the shape began to change. The torso shortened, the arms lengthened. The creature dropped to all fours and its head morphed into something resembling a deer, a skull. The transformation took maybe 5 seconds. Fluid and continuous, like watching clay being molded by invisible hands. And the whole time, it watched me with eyes that reflected my flashlight like a predator. Its eyes, orange and bright and filled with an intelligence that was completely inhuman. I fired a warning shot into the air. The blast echoed through the forest, and the creature bolted, but it didn't run like an animal. It moved in that shifting, changing way, sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes on 2, sometimes in a strange loping hybrid gait that covered ground impossibly fast. Within seconds, it had vanished into the deeper woods, leaving only disturbed snow and those impossible transforming tracks. I radioed for backup immediately. 2 more officers arrived within 20 minutes, along with a state trooper. I showed them the tracks, walked them through what I'd seen. They took photographs, made measurements, collected snow samples from the prints. Everyone was professional and thorough, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. This kind of thing didn't happen. Couldn't happen. We followed the tracks for another mile before losing them in a rocky area where the snow couldn't accumulate. The trail just ended, like the creature had vanished into thin air or climbed straight up the rock face. We searched until dawn, found nothing else. No den, no more tracks, no evidence beyond what we already documented. The official report classified it as an animal sighting, possibly a deer or bear exhibiting unusual behavior due to disease or injury. My detailed account of the transforming tracks was included but noted as unconfirmed. The photograph showed the prints clearly, but without context they could be explained as multiple animals crossing the same path. The case was filed and forgotten, but I couldn't forget. I started researching, digging through old police reports and newspaper archives. Found 3 similar cases in Clearfield County over the past 20 years. All involved tracks that changed from animal to human. All involved witnesses describing creatures that shifted shape. All were officially classified as misidentifications or hoaxes. I also found older records, historical accounts from the 1800s, when this area was first being settled. The local Native American tribes had legends about shapeshifters living in these mountains. Creatures that could take the form of animals or humans, walking between worlds, hunting those who ventured too far from safety. The settlers dismissed these stories as superstition, but the disappearances they attributed to wolf attacks or people getting lost matched the patterns I was seeing in modern cases. Last month, I responded to another call. Different location, same county. A hunter reported seeing something in the woods that changed from a deer to a person right in front of him. By the time I arrived, the hunter had left the area and refused to come back, even to make an official statement. But I found tracks, the same impossible transitional prints, moving from hooves to human feet to something else entirely. I started carrying a camera with me on patrol. Keep it ready to document evidence if I encounter this thing again. My sergeant thinks I'm obsessed, that I'm seeing patterns where none exist. That's right. Maybe the isolation and the darkness and the endless winter nights are playing tricks on my perception. But I don't think so. I think there is something living in the forests around DuBois. Something that has been here longer than our towns and our civilization. Something that can change its shape, that can move between forms as easily as we change clothes. And I think it is watching us, studying us, deciding when and where to appear. Linda Hartman moved away 3 weeks after my visit, sold her farmhouse at a loss and relocated to her daughter's place in Ohio. She called me before she left, told me she still saw it some nights, watching her from the tree line. Said it was getting bolder, coming closer, testing boundaries. She asked if I thought it would follow her to Ohio. I told her I didn't have the heart to tell her about the other cases, the pattern suggesting this thing had territory spanning multiple counties. I drive past her old farmhouse sometimes on night patrol. The property sits empty now, snow-covered and dark, but I I've seen tracks in the yard, circling the abandoned building, always changing from one form to another. And sometimes, when my headlights sweep across the tree line, I catch a glimpse of something standing there. Something watching. Something that shifts and changes in the brief moment before it disappears back into the shadows. The thing that haunts me most is what I saw that night. It's the question of how many times this has happened without anyone reporting it. How many people have seen something impossible in these woods and stayed silent because they knew no one would believe them? How many tracks have been covered by snow or rain before anyone could document them? And the bigger question, the one that keeps me awake some nights, if this creature can change its shape so completely, so fluidly, how do we know it stays in the forest? How do we know it doesn't to walk among us, wearing a human form, moving through our towns and cities, hunting in plain sight? I look at people differently now. Watch for the small signs that something might be wrong. An unnatural gait, eyes that reflect light wrong, movements that are just slightly off, like someone learning to be human but not quite getting it right. I've never seen anything conclusive, but I keep watching, keep documenting, keep waiting for the moment when I'll see those transforming tracks again and maybe, finally, get proof that will make people believe. Because the shapeshifter is real. It hunts in Clearfield County. And the official police reports, with all their careful language about animal sightings and misidentifications, are just another way of covering up something too terrifying to acknowledge. That we're not alone in these Pennsylvania mountains. That we share this territory with something older, something stranger, something that sees our human form as just another shape to be worn and discarded when convenient. If you ever driving through DuBois on a winter night, if you see tracks in the snow that don't quite make sense, that change from one form to another, don't follow them. Don't investigate. Just drive away and forget what you saw. Because once you've seen the shapeshifter, once you know it's real, it knows you've seen it too. And that is when you become interesting. That's when you become something worth watching. Something worth visiting on dark nights when the snow is falling and no one else will see what happens. The tracks are still out there, still changing, still moving through the forests and fields around DuBois. And somewhere in those woods, the thing that makes them is waiting. Patient, eternal, hungry, shape-shifting through the Pennsylvania darkness, hunting for the next person foolish enough to follow those impossible prints into places where the rules of nature dawn to apply and monsters walk freely in forms we can to quite recognize until it's far too late to run. Story 4. Altoona Mountain Lurker. What would you do if something was following you through the mountains, matching your pace exactly, and when you finally got it on camera, the footage showed something that shouldn't exist? My name is Tom Richardson. I am 46 years old, a wildlife photographer from Blair County, Pennsylvania. I've spent 20 years hiking the ridges and valleys around Altoona, photographing deer, bears, eagles, every kind of animal that calls these mountains home. I thought I knew these woods, thought I'd seen everything they had to offer. But in October 2014, I captured something on my thermal imaging camera that ended my career, destroyed my reputation, and left me afraid to set foot in the wilderness I once loved. I was doing a solo expedition on Brush Mountain, about 8 miles northeast of Altoona proper. The area is remote, accessible only by rough trails that most hikers avoid. Perfect for wildlife photography because the animals aren't used to human presence. I set up camp near a game trail, planning to spend 3 days documenting nocturnal predator behavior using thermal cameras and motion sensors. The first night was normal. Captured footage of a black bear, several white-tailed deer, a few coyotes. Standard stuff. But around 2 in the morning, my motion sensor array started going crazy. Multiple triggers along the ridge line, something large moving through the forest in a pattern that didn't make sense. Too fast for a bear, too deliberate for a deer. The movement suggested intelligence, like whatever was out there was intentionally testing my perimeter, looking for weak points. I grabbed my thermal camera and stepped out of the tent. The device showed heat signatures in shades of white, yellow, and red against the cool blue-black of the environment. I scanned the tree line, looking for whatever had triggered my sensors. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, about 70 yards away, I caught it. A heat signature, humanoid, tall and thin, maybe 6.5 feet, standing completely motionless behind a cluster of trees. My first thought was another hiker, Maybe someone lost or in trouble. I called out, asked if they needed help. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my voice at all. Just stood there, and even through the thermal display I could sense it was watching me. The posture was wrong somehow. Too rigid, too still. Humans fidget, shift their weight, breathe in ways that create visible movement even on thermal. This thing was like a statue. I raised the camera and zoomed in, trying to get better detail. The thermal signature showed a body temperature slightly cooler than human normal, around 93 degrees instead of 98. The proportions were off too. The torso was too long. The arms hung too low, past where the knees should be. And the head was elongated, almost conical, nothing like a human skull shape. Then it moved, not toward me, not away. It shifted laterally, gliding behind another tree with a fluid motion that looked wrong on something that size. And it was fast. The movement took maybe 2 seconds, covering 15 feet of rough terrain without any visible effort, without making a sound I could hear over the wind. I was recording all of this. My camera captured every frame in high-definition thermal imaging. Whatever this thing was, I had proof of its existence. But standing there in the darkness, watching it move through the forest with that inhuman grace, all I felt was fear. This wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. This wasn't a person in a costume. This was something else entirely. I retreated into my tent, zipped it closed like fabric would offer any protection, and monitored my sensors for the rest of the night. The thing circled my camp 7 times over the next 4 hours. Always staying just out of clear sight, always maintaining that same distance. The motion sensors tracked its path, a perfect spiral getting gradually tighter, closing in on my position with mathematical precision. At dawn, it disappeared. The sensors went quiet. I waited until full daylight before leaving the tent, and when I finally worked up the courage to check the perimeter, I found tracks. Footprints in the soft soil, humanoid but wrong. 3 toes instead of 5, with deep claw impressions at the front. The stride length was over 6 feet, far longer than any human could manage, and the depth suggested something weighing at least 300 pounds despite the thin profile I'd seen on thermal. I should have packed up and left immediately. Should have taken my footage to the authorities and let them deal with it. But I am a photographer. Documentation is in my blood. I needed more evidence, better footage, clear daylight shots that would prove this wasn't a hoax or equipment malfunction. So I stayed. The second night, it came back earlier. Started circling at dusk, just as the light was failing. I had my regular camera ready this time, not just thermal. Set up in a blind eye, deconstructed, waiting for the creature to come close enough for a clear shot. The thermal showed it moving through the trees, always staying just beyond good visual range, always aware of exactly where I was. Around 8 p.m., I got my shot. The thing stepped into a clearing maybe 40 yards away, fully visible for the first time. I raised my camera, focused, and started shooting rapid bursts, praying the low light wouldn't ruin the images. What I saw through the viewfinder still haunts me. The creature was humanoid in the loosest sense, standing upright on 2 legs, but the resemblance ended there. The skin was gray, not like ash gray but like the color of storm clouds, with a texture that looked rough and weathered. The body was gaunt, ribs clearly visible, limbs too thin to support that height. The head was the worst part, elongated and smooth, almost featureless except for dark pits where eyes should be and a horizontal slash of a mouth that was too wide and too thin. It turned and looked directly at my blind, made eye contact, or whatever passed for eye contact with something that had holes instead of eyes. And I swear it smiled. That thin mouth widened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that gleamed in the fading light. Then it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at me. Not threatening, not beckoning, just pointing, acknowledging. Like it wanted me to know that it knew exactly where I was hiding. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Just kept my finger on the shutter button, capturing frame after frame, documenting this impossible thing standing in the Pennsylvania wilderness 40 yards from my position. The encounter lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then the creature turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkening forest with that same fluid, wrong motion I'd seen the night before. I reviewed the images immediately. Clear, high-resolution shots of the creature from multiple angles. Irrefutable proof that something unknown was living in these mountains. I was shaking with a mixture of fear and excitement. This would change everything. My career, scientific understanding of wildlife, the very nature of what we thought existed in the American wilderness. The third night, I set up every piece of equipment I had. Multiple thermal cameras at different angles, motion sensors in overlapping arrays, audio recorders to capture any sounds. I was building a comprehensive data set, multiple forms of evidence that would withstand any skepticism. The scientific community would have to acknowledge this discovery. The creature appeared at midnight, but this time, it brought company. My thermal cameras picked up 3 heat signatures, all matching the profile of the first creature. They approached from different directions, moving in coordinated patterns, clearly communicating somehow despite being separated by hundreds of yards. They were hunting, and I was the prey. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't documenting a rare animal. I was being studied by something intelligent, something that had been watching me for 3 days, learning my patterns, my equipment, my vulnerabilities. The circles weren't random wandering. They were reconnaissance, and now that they gathered enough information, they were moving in. I grabbed my essential gear and ran, left behind thousands of dollars in equipment, left behind my tent and supplies, left behind everything except my camera with the creature, its images, and the thermal unit that had first captured it. I ran through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches tearing at my clothes, following the trail by feel and the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Behind me, I could hear them. Not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of displacement, of something large moving through space without quite touching the ground. And that sound was getting closer, matching my desperate pace, herding me away from the main trail and deeper into the mountains. I reached a steep ravine and had no choice but to climb down, half sliding down the rocky slope, scraping my hands raw on the stone, the thermal camera banging against my chest. At the bottom, I looked back up the slope and saw them silhouetted against the night sky. 3 impossibly tall figures standing at the edge, looking down at me, their elongated heads tilted in unison like they were having a conversation about what to do with this intruder in their territory. Then they started climbing down. Not carefully like a human would. They flowed down the rock face, bodies contorting in ways that defied anatomy, moving with spider-like fluidity that turned my stomach. I ran again, following the creek at the bottom of the ravine, splashing through shallow water, not caring about the noise because silence wouldn't save me now. I don't know how long I ran. Hours maybe. The creature stayed with me the entire time, always just out of sight, always close enough that I could hear them moving through the forest. They were toying with me. Could have caught me at any point but chose not to, extending the hunt, savoring my fear. Dawn saved me. As the sky started to lighten, the sounds of pursuit faded. I risked a glance at my thermal camera and saw the heat signatures retreating, moving back toward the deep wilderness at speeds no living thing should be able to achieve. By the time the sun fully rose, they were gone. I reached a ranger station around 8 in the morning, exhausted and terrified and clutching my cameras like they were the only proof I hadn't lost my mind. The rangers listened to my story, gave me coffee and a blanket, then went out to retrieve my abandoned equipment. They found my campsite destroyed, tent shredded, equipment scattered and broken, but no tracks, no evidence of the creatures, just destruction that could be explained by bears or vandals. I showed them the footage, the thermal images, the photographs. They looked at everything carefully, consulted with wildlife experts, sent the files to specialists. The official determination was that I photographed a person in a costume. The thermal signature was explained as someone wearing cooling gel to alter their heat profile. The photographs were dismissed as elaborate hoaxes. No credible wildlife expert believed I discovered an unknown species in Pennsylvania. My reputation was destroyed overnight. Other photographers called me a fraud. Wildlife organizations revoked my credentials. The scientific community labeled me an attention-seeking hoaxer. The images went viral online, but only as examples of obvious fake cryptid evidence. Nobody believed me. Nobody wanted to believe that something like that could exist in the Appalachian Mountains. But I know what I saw. Know what chased me through those woods. And I'm not the only one. I've found other reports, going back decades. Hikers who have seen gaunt gray figures keeping pace with them along ridgelines. Hunters who have found strange three-toed tracks. Campers who have heard that particular sound of something large moving without quite touching the ground. Most people dismiss these reports as misidentifications or hoaxes. But they're a pattern. The sightings cluster around the same area. that remote section of Brush Mountain northeast of Altoona. And they were becoming more frequent, more aggressive, like whatever lives up there is growing bolder, less concerned about being seen. They tried to go back, tried to capture more evidence with better equipment and backup witnesses. But every time I get close to those mountains, I feel them watching. Feel that same intelligence studying me, remembering me as the one who documented their existence and escaped their hunt. They let me go once. I doubt they think they won't make that mistake again. The thermal footage still exists. They uploaded it to multiple servers, shared it with every cryptozoology group and paranormal researcher I could find. Most dismiss it, but some believe. Some understand that there are things in the American wilderness that science hasn't cataloged, predators that have learned to avoid human detection, to move through our world while remaining invisible to everyone except the unlucky few who stumble into their territory. If you are planning to hike in Blair County, particularly around Brush Mountain, please reconsider. If you insist on going, never go alone. Bring multiple people, strong lights, weapons if you legally able. And if you see something tall and gray keeping pace with you along a ridge, dawn, to try to photograph it. Dawn, to try to document it. Just run, get off that mountain as fast as you can and dawn, to look back. Because the Altoona Mountain Lurker ISN, folklore. It is not an urban legend or a case of mistaken identity. It is real. It is intelligent. And it is hunting in those mountains right now, waiting for the next photographer, hiker, or hunter to wander too far from safety and give it another opportunity to demonstrate why humans should fear the wilderness we think we conquered. I haven't set foot in those mountains since 2014. Haven't done any wilderness photography at all. The career I spent 20 years building ended in 3 days because I saw something I wasn't supposed to see and lived to tell about it. Sometimes I wonder if living was actually mercy or if those creatures let me escape specifically so I could spread fear, could warn others away from their territory, could serve as their unwitting guardian by telling this story that nobody wants to believe. And late at night, when I can sleep, I think about those 3 figures standing at the edge of the ravine, looking down at me with eyeless faces, their heads tilted in that synchronized way that suggested communication beyond anything humans can comprehend. I think about how easily they moved through terrain that nearly killed me to cross. How they played with me like a cat plays with a mouse before the final strike. And I wonder what would have happened if the sun hadn't come up. Wonder where I'd be now. Wonder if I had become another missing person statistic. Another hiker who ventured into the Pennsylvania mountains and simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and vague reports of something gray and gaunt seen moving through the trees where search parties would eventually give up looking for remains they did never find. Story 5. Tyrone Train Tunnel Child in Blue. What do you do when a soaking wet child flags you down for help on a dark country road, and the moment you reach for him, he simply disappears into nothing? My name is James Holloway. I am 42 years old, a sales manager who drives through central Pennsylvania every week for work. I've covered these roads for 15 years, know every shortcut and back road between Harrisburg and State College. But last September, on a rainy night near Tyrone, I encountered something that made me question everything I thought I understood about reality, death, and the things that linger in the spaces between. It was just past 10 p.m. when I took the old route through Blair County, trying to shave 20 minutes off my drive home. The rain was coming down hard, the kind of downpour that turns windshield wipers useless and reduces visibility to almost nothing. I was driving slow, maybe 30 miles per hour, following the winding road that runs parallel to the abandoned railroad tracks near the old Tyrone tunnels. That's when my headlights caught him, a child standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe 50 feet ahead. He was waving his arms frantically, the universal signal for help. I could see he was drenched, water streaming off his clothes, his small frame shaking in what had to be near freezing rain. My first thought was accident victim. Maybe his parents had crashed. Maybe he wandered away from a broken down car. Whatever the situation, a child alone on this road in this weather was an emergency. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder, leaving my hazard lights on. The boy was still waving, more urgently now, and even through the rain-streaked windshield I could see he was wearing blue. A blue jacket or shirt, soaked so thoroughly it looked black in my headlights. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. I grabbed my phone and my emergency flashlight, ready to call 911 the moment I assessed the situation. Opened my door and stepped out into the downpour, immediately soaked to the skin. The cold hit me like a physical blow. Rain so heavy it felt like standing under a waterfall. I called out to the boy, told him I was here to help, asked where his parents were. He didn't respond, just kept waving, his movements jerky and desperate. I moved closer, flashlight beam cutting through the rain, and that's when I got my first clear look at his face. He was pale, not just pale from cold or fear, pale like something that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. His lips were blue, his eyes were dark and hollow, and there was something wrong with the way he looked at me. Something empty and desperate and utterly hopeless. I was maybe 10 feet away when he spoke. His voice was thin and distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. He said he needed help, said he couldn't find his way home, said the water was so cold and he'd been lost for so long. The words made sense individually, but together they felt wrong, like he was reciting something memorized rather than actually communicating. I reached out my hand, told him to come with me, told him I'd get him warm and safe and we'd find his family. He took a step toward me, his small hand extending toward mine. Our fingers were inches apart. I could see the water dripping from his sleeve, could see his hand trembling in the cold. Then he vanished, not faded, not ran away, vanished. 1 second he was there, solid and real and terrified. The next second there was nothing but rain falling on empty road. No sound, no movement, just the darkness and the downpour and my own ragged breathing as my mind tried to process what had just happened. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, frozen in shock and confusion. Then survival instinct kicked in. I ran back to my car, locked the doors, sat there shaking and staring at the empty spot where the child had been standing. My rational mind cycled through explanations. Hallucination, exhaustion, some trick of the rain and shadows. But I knew what I'd seen. That boy had been real, and then he wasn't. I drove away slowly, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Couldn't shake the image of that pale face, those hollow eyes, that desperate voice saying the water was so cold. When I got home, I told my wife I'd seen something strange on the road. A child who disappeared. She suggested I'd been driving too long, maybe dozed off for a second and dreamed it. I wanted to believe her, wanted to write it off as exhaustion or imagination. But the next day, I couldn't let it go. I started researching, found online forums about paranormal encounters in Pennsylvania, found local history archives, found newspaper articles from the Tyrone area. And that is when I discovered I wasn't the first person to see the child in blue. The reports went back decades. Multiple drivers describing the exact same encounter on the same stretch of road near the old train tunnels. A young boy, soaking wet, wearing blue clothing, waving for help. Some drivers stopped, some didn't. But everyone who stopped reported the same thing. The child would disappear when they got close, just evaporate into nothing, leaving behind only wet pavement and the overwhelming sensation of sadness. I found the historical connection in a 1923 newspaper article from the Tyrone Daily Herald. A 7-year-old boy named Thomas Brennan had drowned during a flash flood that had swept through the area. His body was found 3 days later near one of the old railroad tunnels, wearing a blue jacket that his mother had made for him. The funeral announcement described him as a cheerful child who loved trains and often played near the tracks despite his parents' warnings. The location of his drowning matched exactly where I encountered the apparition. Same stretch of road, same proximity to the tunnels. And the description matched too. Young boy, blue clothing, desperate for help. But the help came too late in 1923. And apparently, some part of Thomas Brennan never moved on, never accepted that he drowned in that cold water, never stopped trying to find his way home. I should have left it alone, should have accepted that I witnessed something paranormal and moved on with my life. But I became obsessed, started driving that route deliberately, always at night, always in bad weather, trying to see him again. My wife thought I was losing my mind. My boss noticed my performance slipping. But I needed answers, needed to understand why this child was trapped, why he appeared to random drivers, what he wanted beyond just help. 3 weeks after my first encounter, I saw him again. Same location, same desperate waving. This time I was prepared. I had a video camera mounted on my dashboard, recording everything. I stopped the car, got out, and approached him slowly. He looked exactly the same. Pale face, hollow eyes, blue clothing soaked and dripping, and that voice, thin and distant, asking for help, saying the water was so cold. This time I tried to communicate, asked him his name, asked him what year it was, asked him if he knew he passed away. He didn't seem to understand the questions, just kept repeating the same phrases. Help me, I'm lost. The water is so cold. I can't find my way home. Like a recording stuck on loop, playing the same desperate message over and over. I told him I knew who he was, told him his name was Thomas Brennan and he drowned in 1923. Told him his parents were gone, that nearly a century had passed, that he needed to let go and move on. He looked at me with those hollow eyes, and for just a second, I saw recognition, saw understanding, saw the terrible realization that he was dead and had been for decades. Then the expression changed to something worse. Pure terror. He started backing away, shaking his head, his mouth opening in what should have been a scream, but no sound came out. He raised his hands like he was trying to ward off something behind me, something I couldn't see. And then he vanished again, but this time I heard something. A sound like rushing water, like a wave crashing, there and gone in an instant. I reviewed the dashboard camera footage when I got home. The recording showed me getting out of the car, showed me standing on the shoulder in the rain, apparently talking to empty air. There was no child visible in the video, no figure in blue, nothing but me having a one-sided conversation with darkness. But the audio picked up something. At the moment Thomas vanished, there, as his sound on the recording. Faint but distinct, the sound of rushing water and a child screaming. After that encounter, the sightings became more frequent. Other drivers started reporting the child in blue more often, sometimes multiple times a week. And the encounters were changing. The boy wasn't just waving for help anymore. Sometimes he was crying. Sometimes he was running, like something was chasing him. Sometimes he appeared directly in front of cars, causing drivers to swerve and crash. 3 accidents were reported in October alone. One driver ended up in the hospital with serious injuries after swerving to avoid what he described as a drenched child who appeared in his lane without warning. The police investigated, found no child in the area, classified it as driver error. But I knew better. Thomas was becoming more active, more desperate, more dangerous. I contacted paranormal investigators, people who claimed to specialize in helping earthbound spirits move on. A team came out from Pittsburgh in November, set up equipment near the tunnel, tried to make contact. They got readings they couldn't explain. Temperature drops, electromagnetic anomalies, EVP recordings that captured a child's voice saying the same phrases witnesses had reported. But when they tried to communicate, tried to help the spirit cross over, things went wrong. One of the investigators, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, said she felt something grab her arm while they were conducting a session. Said it felt like a child, his hand, small and cold and desperately strong. When she looked down, there were handprints on her arm, visible indentations like someone had gripped her tightly. But there was no one there. The marks faded after a few minutes, but she left immediately, refused to continue the investigation, and told me later that whatever was haunting that stretch of road wasn't just a lost spirit. It was something that had been lost so long it had become something else. Something angry. Something that blamed the living for not saving it. I made one final trip to the site in December, parked near the old tunnel where Thomas had drowned, walked down to where the creek still ran, swollen with winter rain. Stood there in the cold and the darkness and spoke out loud, telling Thomas that I was sorry no one could save him in 1923. Sorry that he'd been trapped here for so long. Sorry that every attempt to help had only made things worse. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath misting in the air. I felt that presence, that sense of being watched that every witness had described. And I heard him, not the distant, hollow voice from our previous encounters. This was different, closer, more real. He said he understood now. Said he remembered drowning, remembered the cold water filling his lungs, remembered dying. But he said he couldn't leave. Said something was keeping him here, something connected to the tunnel, to the water, to the moment of his death. Then he asked me a question that froze my blood. He asked if I could see them too. The others, the ones who had drowned before him and after him. The ones trapped in the same loop, appearing on the same stretch of road, desperate for help that would never come. He said there were dozens of them, all along this route, all near water, all caught in the moment of their deaths, replaying it forever. I asked him to show me, asked him to let me see what he saw. The air grew colder, the darkness deepened, and for just a moment, I saw them. Figures along the road, near the creek, by the tunnel entrance. Men, women, children, all with that same pale appearance, all soaking wet, all waving desperately for help. Some from recent decades, some from the 1800s based on their clothing. All trapped, all aware, all suffering. Then the vision ended and I was alone again by the creek, shaking not from cold but from the terrible understanding of what this place was. It wasn't just haunted by one spirit. It was a collection point, a place where death by drowning left an imprint so strong that the victims couldn't move on. The tunnel, the water, something about this specific location kept them here, kept them replaying their final desperate moments, seeking help that would always arrive too late. I haven't gone back since that night. The stretch of road near the Tyrone tunnels is still active, still claimed victims in accidents caused by drivers swerving to avoid apparitions that shouldn't exist. The police have added warning signs about dangerous curves. The state has improved lighting, but none of that addresses the real problem. None of it helps the spirits trapped there, doomed to wave for help throughout eternity. Thomas Brennan, the child in blue, is still there, still appearing on rainy nights, still asking for help in that thin, distant voice. And now I know he is not alone. There are others with him, all caught in the same terrible loop, all desperate to be saved but unable to accept that salvation came too late almost a century ago. If you be ever driving through Blair County near Tyrone, particularly on rainy nights near the old train tunnels, please be careful. If you see a child waving for help on the roadside, if you see anyone soaking wet and desperate on that stretch of road, stop. To try to help. You can deceive them. They were already gone. And trying to help only makes their suffering worse, only strengthens their connection to this world, only ensures they remain trapped in that moment of desperate need forever. The dead should rest, but some places want to let them. And the old Tyrone tunnels are one of those places where the boundary between life and death is thin enough that the desperate and drowning can still reach across, still beg for rescue, still wave frantically at passing cars in the eternal hope that this time, finally, someone will save them from water that stopped flowing decades before most of us were even born. Story 6. Danville Phantom Car. I was driving behind the black sedan when it simply ceased to exist. One moment I could see it clearly in my headlights, maybe 50 feet ahead on Route 11 near Danville, Pennsylvania. The next moment, there was nothing. Not a car that turned off the road. Not a car that accelerated beyond my sight. The car was there, and then it wasn't, and in the official police report, I am listed as having encountered something the department officially calls an untraceable apparition. My name is Officer Richard Keller. I've been with the Danville Police Department for 14 years. I am a decorated officer with a clean record and a reputation for being thorough and professional. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in supernatural occurrences. I am the kind of cop who writes detailed reports and follows protocol. But on the evening of October 9th, 2019, I encountered something that exists in an official police file as something science doesn't to have a category for. The call came in around 11:30 in the evening. A resident on Washington Street reported that a black car had been driving slowly through residential neighborhoods for the past hour. No headlights, no visible driver, no license plate visible. The caller said that the vehicle seemed to be searching for something. That it would drive slowly down residential streets, then accelerate suddenly and move to different neighborhoods. I was on patrol nearby, so I responded. I drove to the area and immediately began looking for the vehicle. It took about 5 minutes, but I spotted it. A vintage black sedan, maybe 1968 or 1970, moving slowly down a side street. The vehicle was moving methodically, deliberately. It would progress one block, then another, then accelerate suddenly and jump to a different neighborhood entirely. I followed at a distance and radioed dispatch. I reported that I had eyes on the vehicle. I provided the location and direction of travel. I was waiting for backup before attempting to make contact. The dispatcher acknowledged and advised me to keep the vehicle in sight. The black sedan continued its methodical pattern. 1 street, 2 streets, then suddenly accelerating and jumping to a completely different area of town. No normal driver drives like this. No normal person operates a vehicle with such precision and such apparent intention. I was convinced that whoever was driving this car was either intoxicated or dangerous or both. When backup arrived, I initiated the traffic stop. I activated my emergency lights. I used my loudspeaker to direct the vehicle to pull over. For a moment, it seemed like the vehicle was responding. The brake lights came on. The car slowed, It was pulling toward the side of the road near the Walnut Street Bridge. Then it accelerated, suddenly and violently. The vintage sedan exploded forward with acceleration that no car of that age should have been capable of. I pursued immediately, activating my emergency lights and siren. The second officer who had arrived as backup followed in his vehicle. We were now in a high-speed chase through residential streets. The black sedan was doing 70 miles per hour on roads designed for 35. It was running red lights. It was taking turns with impossible precision. It was driving like it knew exactly where it was going, like it was being driven by something that had absolute knowledge of the road layout and no regard for safety. The chase continued for approximately 3 miles. The black sedan led us through downtown Danville and toward the Walnut Street Bridge. That bridge is significant in the history of the town. It was built in 1914 and has been the subject of local folklore for decades. Suicides have occurred there. Accidents have occurred there. There is a dark history connected to that bridge. The sedan approached the bridge at high speed. I was pursuing directly behind the vehicle, maintaining a distance of maybe 30 feet. My backup officer was further back. The bridge entrance was visible ahead. The road was clear. There were no vehicles coming in the opposite direction. Everything was visible and normal. The black sedan reached the bridge entrance. It maintained its speed. It did not slow down. It did not brake. It simply continued forward at approximately 70 miles per hour toward the bridge. I watched as the vehicle reached the entrance. I watched as it should have crossed onto the bridge structure, but it didn't. It crossed the bridge. It simply disappeared. I was close enough to see this clearly. I was close enough to know that I wasn't experiencing an optical illusion. The vehicle did not crash. The vehicle did not brake and turn. The vehicle was there, moving forward, and then it was simply gone. Vanished, as if it had never existed at all. I came to a complete stop at the bridge entrance. I got out of my vehicle. I looked across the bridge. It was empty. No black sedan. No smoke. No evidence of a crash. No debris. Nothing. The bridge was exactly as it should have been, except that the vehicle I had been chasing was no longer present in this world. My backup officer, Officer James Patterson, arrived and exited his vehicle. He was asking me what happened. He was asking where the vehicle had gone. I couldn't provide an answer. I told him that the vehicle had entered the bridge and disappeared. He thought I was joking. He thought I was experiencing some kind of mental break from the adrenaline of the chase. We secured the scene. We called for additional backup. We conducted a thorough search of the bridge and the area surrounding it. We checked under the bridge. We searched the river below. We interviewed nearby residents to see if anyone had seen the vehicle. Nothing. No evidence. No explanation. No vehicle. The official report I filed described the vehicle as having disappeared during the pursuit. My supervisor suggested alternative explanations. The vehicle could have turned off the road while I wasn't looking. The vehicle could have been a vision brought on by stress and exhaustion. The vehicle could have crashed somewhere that I didn't see, and the driver could have fled on foot. But Officer Patterson had been behind me. Officer Patterson had seen the chase. Officer Patterson had arrived at the bridge location and knew that the vehicle had simply vanished. The original report from dispatch was documented. The call of a suspicious vehicle was documented. My pursuit was documented. The unexplainable disappearance of the vehicle was documented. And then the incident was closed. No investigation, no follow-up, no official statement acknowledging that something had occurred that couldn't be explained by conventional means. The vehicle was listed in the report as an untraceable apparition. I tried to move on. I tried to forget about the incident, but something about that night had marked me. Something about what I had witnessed had changed something inside my understanding of how the world works. And more troublingly, I had become aware that other officers in the department knew something about that bridge. Something that nobody was willing to discuss openly. I started asking quiet questions. I spoke to senior officers. I spoke to retired officers. What I learned was a history that the department had been managing for a very long time. The black sedan had been reported before, multiple times, going back decades. The earliest documented report was from 1983. An officer had pursued a similar vintage black sedan that had disappeared on the Walnut Street Bridge. The officer had filed a report using almost identical language to my own report. A vehicle that was there and then was not there. Over the years, there had been additional reports. 7 total incidents between 1983 and my encounter in 2019. 7 times, different officers had pursued the black sedan. 7 times, the vehicle had led them to the Walnut Street Bridge. 7 times, the vehicle had vanished. The department had an informal protocol. If you encounter the black sedan, you pursue it. You attempt to stop it. And you do not question what happens when it reaches the bridge. The incident is filed with minimal detail. The vehicle is listed as unidentified. No investigation is conducted. The incident is forgotten as quickly as possible. One retired officer, a man named Walter Collins, who had been with the department since 1970, agreed to meet with me off the books. He told me that he had chased the black sedan in 1992. He told me that he had seen it vanish on the Walnut Street Bridge. He told me that afterwards, he had conducted research into the history of the bridge and what might explain the phenomenon. What he discovered was a tragedy from 1915. A man named Samuel Hendrick had been driving a black sedan, one of the first automobiles in Danville. He had been fleeing from police. The reason for the pursuit was unclear. Records were unclear on that point. But Samuel had been driving recklessly through town. He had led police toward the Walnut Street Bridge, which had just been completed the year before. Samuel had reached the bridge at high speed. He had lost control of the vehicle. The car had crashed through the bridge railing and fallen into the river below. Samuel had died in the crash. His body had been recovered from the river, but the vehicle had never been recovered. The car had been lost in the river and never found, until it started appearing decades later. Still driving the same route. Still being pursued by police. Still reaching the Walnut Street Bridge and vanishing. Walter Collins told me something else. He said that the officers who encountered the Phantom Car reported similar experiences in the months following the incident. The officers would experience episodes where they would relive the chase. They would dream about driving behind the black sedan. They would find themselves unable to cross the Walnut Street Bridge without experiencing a sense of profound dread. One officer, according to Walter, had eventually succumbed to this psychological weight. The officer had driven his own car to the bridge one night. He had driven directly into the railing. He had died in what was officially ruled a suicide, but which Walter believed was something else. The officer had been called to the bridge by the Phantom Car. The officer had answered that call. I asked Walter if he thought the Phantom Car was dangerous. Walter said that he didn't think the car was dangerous. He thought the car was lonely. He thought that Samuel Hendrick had been driven insane by spending a century trapped in a moment of terror. 100 years of crashing. 100 years of dying. 100 years of being pulled from the river and existing in some state between life and death. And Samuel, this Phantom Car, was reaching out, touching the minds of police officers, looking for connection, looking for understanding. I started to understand why the department had never investigated these incidents. They weren't trying to cover something up. They were trying to contain something. Every time a new officer chased that black sedan, the department was feeding Samuel Hendrick what he was looking for. Connection, interaction, acknowledgement of his existence, but the department was also protecting officers from deeper contact with Samuel's consciousness. A thorough investigation would require following the Phantom Car further, would require going deeper into whatever dimension the vehicle occupied, would require more intimate contact with whatever Samuel had become. 2 years after my encounter with the Phantom Car, I was off duty at home when I heard the sound. The distinctive rumble of an old automobile engine. I went to my window and looked out. On the street below, the black sedan was driving slowly past my house. No headlights, no visible driver, just the vehicle, moving slowly, searching. I felt something then, a presence, an awareness that was looking for me specifically. The black sedan continued down my street, then disappeared around a corner. Since that night, the car has returned periodically. It appears on the streets near my home. It drives slowly. It searches. It is looking for something. I understand now that Samuel Hendrick has developed a connection to me. That my pursuit of his Phantom Car has created a link between his consciousness and mine. I have been transferred to desk duty. I am no longer allowed to patrol streets that lead to the Walnut Street Bridge. I am no longer allowed to respond to traffic calls in certain parts of the city. The department knows what is happening. The department is trying to protect me from deeper contact with Samuel, this consciousness. But I know the truth. I know that eventually, the Phantom Car will appear one night in a location where I can, to avoid it. It will lead me toward that bridge. It will drive with intention and purpose. And this time, I want to stop the pursuit. This time, I'll follow Samuel Hendrick across that bridge and into whatever exists on the other side. Because I realized something through this experience. Samuel Hendrick ISN, T malevolent. He is trapped. He is dying the same death over and over for 100 years. And he is looking for someone who understands. Someone who has witnessed his tragedy. Someone who will finally acknowledge that he existed. That his death mattered. that his suffering mattered. And maybe, just maybe, if someone finally follows him all the way across that bridge, if someone finally experiences his death alongside him, the cycle will break. Samuel will finally find peace. The Phantom Car will finally stop appearing. And the officers of Danville Police Department will finally be able to investigate that bridge without encountering the supernatural. The Walnut Street Bridge is real. The Phantom Car is real. And Samuel Hendrick is still there, driving his black sedan, still crashing, still dying, still searching for someone who will finally understand his eternal tragedy. I see the bridge in my dreams now. I see the railing approaching at high speed. I feel the moment of impact. And I know that one night soon, when the black sedan appears on my street, I won't resist the urge to follow. I'll pursue it toward the bridge. And this time, I want to stop at the edge of whatever dimension the vehicle occupies. This time, I'll complete the journey that Samuel started 100 years ago. I'll cross that bridge with him. I'll experience his death. And maybe, finally, I'll both find whatever exists on the other side of that horrible moment of impact. The Phantom Car is patient. It has waited 100 years for the right officer. It has waited 100 years for someone who understands. And I think I am finally ready to give Samuel Hendrick what he has been asking for all this time. I think I am finally ready to follow him home. Story 7. Haunted Railroad of Catawissa. I felt the train lurch. I heard the terrible screech of the wheels locking on the tracks. I felt the enormous weight of the locomotive shifting and fighting against the emergency brake. And in the beam of the headlight, I saw nothing. Nothing beneath the wheels. Nothing that could have caused the impact. But something was there. Something invisible. Something that grabbed our 300-ton train and held it. My name is Edward Brennan. I am a retired railroad engineer who spent 37 years operating freight and passenger trains across northeastern Pennsylvania. I spent the majority of that time on the Catawissa branch line, a scenic route through Columbia County that has been operating with minimal interruptions since 1892. I have logged more than 4 million miles on the rails. I have encountered weather, mechanical failures, and emergency situations. But nothing in my entire career prepared me for what happened on that dark October evening in 1998. The Catawissa line is beautiful. It runs through forests and farmland and small towns. The route passes through tunnels carved from solid rock and over trestles that span deep valleys. For most of my career, I loved that route. I loved the rhythm of the rails. I loved the predictability of the schedule. I loved the feeling of commanding a machine of such tremendous power and precision. But the Catawissa line also has a reputation. Among the railroad workers, among the conductors and switchmen and maintenance crews, there were stories. Stories passed down through generations of railway employees. Stories about a lantern that appeared on the tracks at night. A swinging lantern with no holder. A light that would appear in the darkness and then vanish. A light that had been reported for more than 100 years. The official explanation was always the same. Bioluminescence. Methane gas igniting from decomposing material near the tracks. Reflections of actual lanterns held by maintenance workers. Optical illusions created by darkness and fatigue. The railroad company never officially acknowledged that anything unusual was happening on the Catawissa line. But they also issued specific instructions to engineers about what to do if they encountered the lantern. The instructions were simple and chilling. If you see a lantern on the tracks, reduce speed immediately. Do not stop. Do not investigate. Do not shine lights on it. Just reduce speed and proceed with caution. Many engineers interpreted this as standard protocol for unknown obstacles. But I always understood it differently. The railroad company had seen something happen. They had watched engineers encounter that lantern, and they were trying to prevent whatever occurred when an engineer engaged with it directly. I first saw the lantern in 1981. I had been operating trains on the Catawissa line for almost 5 years at that point. I was confident in my abilities. I understood the route. I knew the curves and the grades and the sight lines. I was running a freight train late at night, heading north toward Williamsport. The weather was clear. The visibility was good. I was making good time. Then I saw it, a light on the tracks ahead. Red, swinging back and forth with a steady rhythm. A lantern, held by nothing, swinging in the air above the rails. I immediately began reducing speed, following protocol. The train slowed from 50 miles per hour to 30, then to 20. The lantern grew larger as I approached it. The red glow became more distinct. My conductor, a man named Paul Reeves who had been working the line for 15 years, was sitting next to me. When he saw the lantern, he went completely still. His face went pale. He told me to slow down more, to reduce speed further. I brought the train down to 10 miles per hour. We were crawling along the tracks. The lantern was about 100 feet in front of us now. I could see it clearly, swinging back and forth. The light was warm and red and absolutely real. This wasn't a reflection or an illusion. This was something physical, something present. Then it stopped swinging. The lantern froze in mid-motion. It just hung there in the air, stationary. And it started to move toward us, slowly, deliberately, floating above the tracks, approaching the locomotive. Paul screamed. I had never heard Paul scream before. He was a professional with decades of experience. He screamed. But he screamed then. He was pointing at the lantern and screaming and telling me to stop the train. I hit the emergency brake. The wheels locked. The train decelerated with tremendous force. The entire locomotive shuddered and groaned with the effort of stopping. The lantern was right in front of us now, just a few feet from the front of the locomotive. And I could see that something was holding it. Not a hand exactly, but something, a shape, a form that was barely visible in the darkness. A shape that had substance but no real definition. Paul unbuckled himself and ran to the back of the locomotive. He was screaming for other crew members. He was shouting for someone to help. I sat frozen in the engineer's seat, staring at the lantern and the shape behind it. Then the lantern moved. It rose vertically. It ascended above the tracks and above the locomotive and disappeared into the night. The shape dissolved into darkness, and the tracks ahead were empty. I sat there for about 5 minutes before I could move. Paul came back to the locomotive cabin, pale and shaking. We didn't talk about what we had seen. We just restarted the train and proceeded slowly along the tracks. We completed the run to Bloomsburg in silence. When we arrived at the terminal, I filed a report. I described the lantern and the shape and what we had witnessed. The report was filed with the railroad company. It was acknowledged, and then nothing happened. No investigation, no follow-up, no official response. The incident was simply absorbed into the company's institutional knowledge and filed away. But other engineers had filed similar reports. I learned this through conversations with other workers. Different dates, different times, but the same phenomenon. The lantern on the tracks. The shape. The sense of something vast and present and deeply wrong. One engineer named Marcus had filed a report in 1975. He described the lantern and also described hitting something. He had encountered the lantern on the tracks and, instead of slowing down, had accelerated directly toward it. The lantern had vanished, but the train had lurched violently. He had felt impact. He had felt the locomotive strike something solid. Marcus had immediately stopped the train and conducted a thorough inspection of the tracks and the locomotive's undercarriage. He found nothing, no debris, no damage, no evidence of impact, but the train had definitely hit something solid enough to disrupt the motion of a 300-ton machine. I continued operating trains on the Katowice line for another 17 years after my first encounter with the lantern. I saw it 4 more times, 4 separate incidents spanning nearly 2 decades. Each time, I followed protocol. I reduced speed. I did not engage. I let the lantern do whatever it was doing and continued on my way. But in 1998, I made a decision that I have regretted for the rest of my life. I decided to confront it. I decided that after 50 years of reports and 200 years of incidents, it was time for someone to actually understand what that lantern was. I was operating a passenger train that October evening. The train was full of people. Commuters and travelers and families making the journey from Bloomsburg to the southern terminus. We were making good time. The weather was clear. Everything was normal. Then I saw the lantern, red, swinging, on the tracks ahead. But this time, something was different. The lantern was swinging faster than I had ever seen it swing before. Back and forth with frantic motion. Almost like it was signaling something. Almost like it was trying to warn me. I didn't slow down. I did the opposite. I increased speed slightly. I wanted to get close to it. I wanted to see what was actually holding that light. I wanted to understand. My conductor, a younger man named James who had been working the line for only 2 years, asked what I was doing. He said I should be reducing speed. I told him I had encountered this lantern before and that I wanted to investigate it properly this time. James was alarmed. He recommended that I follow protocol, but I was the engineer. The final decision was mine. The lantern grew larger. I was approaching it at 40 miles per hour. 35. The swinging was becoming more frantic, more desperate. The light was pulsing with the motion. That is when I understood. The lantern wasn't trying to signal danger. It was trying to warn us. It was trying to tell us to stop, to slow down, to do anything but approach. I hit the emergency brake, but it was too late. The train was already impacting something that had moved onto the tracks. something that my headlight had illuminated for just a moment before we struck it. The impact was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the impact of hitting a solid object on the ground. It was the impact of hitting something that had weight and dimension but no physical structure. It was like hitting water, except that the water was solid and conscious. The train lurched. The entire locomotive twisted in a way that locomotives shouldn't T-twist. I was thrown from my seat. I crashed against the control panel. I felt bones break. I heard the terrible screech of metal and the sound of a train being forced to stop by something that couldn't be stopped by normal means. The emergency brake brought the train to a halt. I was bleeding. My arm was broken. I could barely move. But I had to know. I had to see what we had hit. I pulled myself up and looked out the window. The lantern was gone. The light was gone. The tracks ahead were empty. I made my way to the external catwalk and looked beneath the locomotive. There was nothing. No debris. No damage to the train. No body. No evidence of impact. The passengers had to be evacuated. Emergency services arrived. An investigation was conducted. The railroad company found nothing unusual. No obstacle on the tracks. No damage that would have caused the impact I had experienced. But they also took me off the Catawissa line permanently. I spent months in recovery. My arm healed. The other injuries healed. But something inside me was permanently damaged. I had felt that thing. I had made contact with whatever was producing that lantern. And it had recognized my intention. It had understood that I was trying to engage with it. I retired early from the railroad. I tried to move on with my life. But the Catawissa line has never left me. I can see that lantern when I close my eyes. I can hear the frantic swinging. I can feel the impact of that collision. And more than that, I understand now what that lantern represents. It's not a warning. It is not a ghost or a spirit or a residual haunting. It is a boundary marker. It is a way of communicating the presence of something that exists at the edge of our world. Something that occupies the same space as the railroad tracks but operates according to rules that we don't understand. The railroad company knows. They have always known. The instructions they give to engineers are T for safety. They re for containment. They re a way of acknowledging that something exists on the Catawissa line without actually admitting that it exists. They re a way of managing the encounters without controlling them. Over the years, they learned from other retired engineers that my experience wasn't unique. At least 6 other engineers have hit that invisible thing over the past 70 years. Each time, they reported impact. Each time, an investigation found nothing. Each time, the engineer was removed from the line. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it is a creature that exists between dimensions. I don't know if it is something that the railroad has disturbed and now can decontain. I don't know if it is a ghost or a spirit or something that doesn't have a word in any language. But I know that it is there. I know that it is conscious. I know that it tries to warn approaching trains with that lantern. And I know that if an engineer doesn't heed the warning, if an engineer pushes forward and refuses to slow down, they will make contact with something that doesn't belong in our world. The Catawissa Railroad is still operating. Trains are still running that route. The lantern is still appearing on the tracks. And somewhere out there is an engineer who hasn't heard the stories. Someone who will see that red light and decide to investigate. Someone who will make the same choice I made. Someone who will try to confront something that should never be confronted. When that happens, when that engineer hits the invisible thing on the tracks, I hope they survive. I hope they come out of it the way I did, damaged but alive. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is becoming part of the Catawissa line, becoming something that swings a lantern in the darkness, becoming a warning to others. I see the railroad tracks sometimes in my dreams. I see the red light swinging, and I hear a voice, not words, just a sound like wind moving through a tunnel, a sound like something trying to communicate across a barrier that can be crossed. The haunted railroad is real. The lantern is real, and whatever is holding that lantern is real. It is still on the Catawissa line, still marking the boundary, still warning approaching trains, and I am still waiting for the day when it decides to pursue me the way I pursued it. The day when it reaches beyond the tracks and finds me in my life. The day when my retirement is interrupted by a red light appearing in my home. The day when I have to look directly into whatever that shape is and acknowledge what I felt when I made contact. The railroad never stops running. The trains never stop traveling that route. And the lantern never stops swinging. Because something on the Catawissa line is making sure that its presence is acknowledged. making sure that we never forget that there are boundaries in this world that shouldn't be crossed. I crossed one, and every day since, they've been waiting for the consequences. Story 8. Basement Voices. A true account from Scranton. I heard them before I saw anything wrong. That's what nobody tells you about real horror. It doesn't come with warning lights or movie music. It comes as sound in the darkness, and by the time you realize what you rehearing, it's already too late to run. My name is Michael. I am a police detective with the Scranton Police Department. They've been on the force for 17 years. They've seen dead bodies in bathtubs, seen what meth addiction does to a human face, seen the absolute worst that people can do to each other. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened in that basement on Lackawanna Avenue on the night of October 16th. The call came in around 11 p.m. A neighbor reported screaming from the old Kovach duplex, the one that had been empty for 3 years. Boarded windows, graffiti covering the front, the kind of forgotten building that sits in every small town in Pennsylvania. Slowly rotting, slowly becoming something else. We didn't know yet that this particular darkness held secrets that would change my understanding of what was possible. When my partner Sarah and I arrived, the street was quiet. Almost too quiet, that buzzing silence you get in old neighborhoods at night, where the houses seem to be listening to each other. The screaming had stopped. The yard was overgrown, weeds breaking through the concrete driveway. Sarah had her hand on her service weapon as we approached. I remember thinking that was smart. I remember thinking we needed to be careful. The front door was ajar, just slightly, like someone had opened it and then forgotten to close it properly. The wood was soft from years of weather exposure, and there were deep gouges along the frame, as if something with nails had clawed at it from the inside. But that is impossible. That's what I tried to tell myself. It's what every rational part of my brain insisted as we pushed that door open and stepped into the black inside. The smell hit us first. Not decay, we both knew what that smelled like. This was different. Musty air, yes, but underneath it was something chemical and wrong, like copper coins mixed with burnt rubber. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a living room that looked like it had been abandoned midlife. A couch with stuffing pouring from split seams. A television from the 1990s on a wooden stand. And on the wall, written in what appeared to be ash or some kind of powder, were dozens of handprints. Large prints, small prints, overlapping each other in a pattern that suggested panic, or ritual, or something worse than the other. Jesus, Sarah whispered, but I wasn't looking at the wall anymore. I was listening, and I could hear something that Sarah apparently couldn't, because she kept moving forward, deeper into the house. It was a sound like wind through a canyon, but inside, and underneath the wind was something else. Whispering, multiple voices, all speaking at once, so layered and overlapping that I couldn't distinguish individual words. Just the sound of human voices saying things I couldn't understand. Do you hear that? I asked Sarah. She stopped. She turned to look at me, and in the beam of her flashlight, I could see the confusion on her face. Hear what? I didn't answer because I wasn't sure how to describe it. The whispering wasn't getting louder, but it was getting clearer, like I was slowly tuning into a radio station that I'd been missing before. It was coming from downstairs, from the basement. The basement door was in the kitchen, and when we got there, we could both smell it stronger. That chemical, wrong smell. The door was metal, newer than the rest of the house, and it was locked. There was a heavy chain wrapped around the handle and padlocked with an industrial strength lock. That detail mattered. That detail meant someone had put that lock there recently. That detail meant someone had not wanted anything getting out of that basement. Sarah was calling for backup while I stood there, staring at the chain. The whispering was louder now, and I could almost make out words. Almost. It was like hearing someone speaking in a language you don't know, but somehow feel like you should understand. The sound sent electricity up my spine, a primal warning that every cell in my body recognized as danger. We waited for backup, and in those 10 minutes, which felt like an hour, I stood and listened to that whispering growing clearer and clearer. There were definitely words now. I could hear them, repeated phrases in a language that might have been something local, something native to Pennsylvania, something old. The other officers arrived, and we called the fire department. It took them 20 minutes to cut through the chain. When the basement door finally opened, the smell that came up was overpowering. Not just the chemical stench, but something organic underneath it, something that my brain immediately recognized as human remains. Officer Clayton, who has seen more than most people want to see in a career, actually gagged. Sarah put her hand over her mouth. The basement stairs descended into absolute black. No windows, no light source. It was the kind of darkness that made me remember being a kid, afraid of what lived under my bed. This was that feeling, but proven right. This was that childhood terror made physical, made real, made dangerous. We went down carefully, our flashlights creating narrow corridors of vision in the black. The whispering grew louder with each step. The temperature dropped, not slightly, noticeably. I could see my breath. That shouldn't have been possible in October in Pennsylvania. The basement should have been at least 60 degrees. But it was cold, cold like standing in a freezer, cold like the air itself had turned against us. The walls were concrete, and they were covered in writing. Thousands of words, maybe tens of thousands, carved into the concrete itself. Names, that's what they were. I started to recognize them. Missing persons from the area. Names from police reports I read. Names from news stories. The writing was ancient, or it was meant to look ancient, with deep carved letters that looked like they'd been made with a knife or a piece of broken glass. All of them carved into the basement walls. And the whispering, now that we were down here, I realized it was coming from everywhere at once. The walls themselves seemed to be speaking. The corners of the basement, the darkness, the air. I felt like I was inside the throat of something that was trying to speak but couldn't quite form the words. Sarah was panicking. I could hear it in her breathing, though she was trying to keep it together. Officer Clayton was holding his weapon up, as if a gun would help against whatever this was. The whispering grew louder, and suddenly I understood something terrible. The voices weren't trying to speak to us. They were voices of something else, something that had been down here for years, something that had been calling for help or calling for food or calling for something I couldn't understand. I made the call to get the audio equipment. I wanted evidence. I wanted proof of what we were hearing. Because even though I was experiencing it, even though every officer there heard it, I already knew that nobody outside this basement would believe us. I knew that this would be one of those cases that got filed away, that got whispered about, that became one of those stories people in Scranton told each other when they wanted to scare themselves. The audio tech from the department, a young guy named Stevens, arrived with professional-grade recording equipment. Military spec stuff, the kind of equipment that records conversations in surveillance cases. He set up 3 recorders, each one pointed at a different section of the basement. The whispering was still constant, still layered, still speaking in a language that felt like it was slipping just out of comprehension. Stevens checked the equipment 3 times. He wanted to make sure it was working. He wanted to be certain that we captured whatever this was. I understood his hesitation. I felt it too. This was the kind of situation where you wanted proof, where you needed proof, because telling this story without it would make you sound insane. The whispering continued as we waited. It never stopped. It never paused. It was like the voices down here had been waiting for an audience. And now that we were here, they were going to speak their story, no matter how long it took. After 3 minutes, Stephen stopped the recording. He played it back. The basement was silent except for our breathing and the soft mechanical sound of the playback. There were no voices. The recording picked up nothing. Our footsteps, yes. The sound of our breathing, definitely. But the whispering that had filled the entire basement, the sound that had been so loud and so clear that I could almost understand it, it had left no trace on the recording. Except for one thing. Right at the end of the 3-minute recording, there was a sound. It wasn't the whispering. It was something else. Something that made every person in that basement freeze completely. It was the sound of a single breath. Slow, deliberate, impossibly deep. A breath that sounded like it came from something much larger than any human being. Something that had lungs the size of a car. Something that had been holding its breath the entire time we were recording and had finally, slowly, released it. When that breath finished, the whispering in the basement stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been. It was absolute. It was complete. It was the silence of something that had said what it needed to say and was now waiting to see what we would do next. We left the basement. All of us. We didn't need to be ordered. We didn't need to discuss it. We all just moved toward the stairs simultaneously, and we climbed up into the living room of that empty house. And we kept climbing until we were outside, standing in the cool Pennsylvania night, breathing air that didn't taste like copper and burnt rubber. We never found the source of the whispering voices. We never discovered who had carved those names into the basement walls or why. We brought in specialists, paranormal researchers, people who said they knew what we experienced. Some of them heard the whispering. Some of them didn't. The ones who did refused to go back. The ones who didn't, they said we were experiencing mass hysteria, that the power of suggestion had made us imagine things. The house was sealed. The basement was marked. And slowly, very slowly, people in Scranton began to forget about it. Or they pretended to forget. That's what happens in small towns. Strange things are accommodated. Strange things are ignored. Strange things are absorbed into the landscape until they become part of the landscape. But I never forgot. And I never stopped wondering about that breath on the recording. The single breath that proved something was down there. Something that was breathing. Something that was alive or semi-alive or existing in a state between those two conditions. Something that had been waiting in that basement, possibly for years, possibly for much longer than that. Sometimes I think about the names carved into those walls. I wonder if they were warnings or tributes. I wonder if the people whose names were down there had somehow become part of whatever was living in that basement, had somehow been absorbed into that darkness and transformed into the voices that we heard. I still have the recording. It's locked away in a safe in my house, and sometimes late at night, when I can sleep, I play it. I skip ahead to the 3-minute mark. I listen to that single breath. And I think about the thing in the basement on Lackawanna Avenue in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I wonder if it is still down there, still waiting, still breathing in the dark. And I wonder if the whispering ever stopped, or if it just learned to hide itself from our technology, from our machines, from our desperate attempt to prove that something terrible exists in the spaces we thought we understood. The Scranton Basement Voices case remains officially unsolved. The house still stands. The basement door, though no longer chained, remains locked. And in the darkness down there, I sometimes imagine I can hear it still. Not the voices anymore, but something deeper. Something patient. Something that knows I'll come back eventually. Something that is still waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to climb down those stairs and listen to what it has to say. Story 9. Marionville Forest Watcher. The thing standing at the edge of my campfire had antlers like a 12-point buck, but the body underneath belonged to no animal I'd ever seen in 30 years of hunting these woods. My name is Daniel Crawford. I am 53 years old, born and raised in Clarion County, Pennsylvania. I've hunted the Allegheny National Forest since I was 16, same as my father and his father before him. I know these woods. Every ridge, every hollow, every game trail between Marionville and the Tionesta Creek. Or at least, I thought I did. What I am about to tell you happened during opening week of deer season, November 2019. I'd driven up from Pittsburgh alone, planning a 4-day solo hunt in a remote section of the forest I'd been scouting all year. The spot was perfect. Dense hemlock groves, fresh scrapes on the trees, deer sign everywhere. No other hunters for miles. Just me, my rifle, and the mountain silence. I set up camp 2 hours before sunset, a simple operation I'd done hundreds of times. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, and a fire ring I'd built on previous trips. The weather was cold but clear, temperature dropping fast as the sun went down. I got the fire going and settled in with a thermos of coffee, watching the woods fade from orange to purple to black. That is when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Every hunter knows that feeling, that animal awareness that comes from spending time in wild places. Usually it's a deer or a coyote, curious but cautious, observing from a safe distance. This felt different, heavier, more deliberate. I scanned the tree line, looking for the telltale gleam of eyes reflecting firelight. Nothing, just darkness and the occasional crack of branches settling in the cold. I told myself it was paranoia, first night jitters, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But my hand drifted to the rifle propped against my camp chair anyway. The fire popped and sent up a shower of sparks. In that brief flare of light, I saw it, standing between 2 hemlock trees, maybe 30 feet from my camp. Motionless, watching. At first glance, my brain tried to make it a deer. The antlers were right, massive and symmetrical, probably a trophy buck. But deer dawn, to stand on 2 legs. Deer dawn, to have shoulders that broad or arms that long. And deer sure as hell dawn, to stare at you with eyes that reflect orange fire like polished copper. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the spot. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. Whatever I'd seen was gone. Moved without a sound, without disturbing a single branch. I sat there for 10 minutes, barely breathing, listening to the forest. The normal night sounds had stopped. No owls, no rustling leaves, just the crackle of my fire and the hammer of my own heartbeat. I should have packed up right then. Should have hiked back to my truck and driven home. But pride and stubbornness kept me planted in that chair. I wasn't gonna let my imagination chase me out of the woods like some scared kid. I'd seen a deer, probably standing on its hind legs to reach high brows. Unusual but not impossible. The isolation and firelight had distorted the image. That's all. I added more wood to the fire and forced myself to eat dinner. Canned soup heated over the flames, tasting like copper and fear. Every shadow beyond the firelight seemed to move. Every sound in the darkness made me flinch. I kept the rifle across my lap, safety off, finger near the trigger. Around 9 o'clock, I heard footsteps. Not deer hooves, not the soft pad of a predator. Heavy bipedal steps, slow and measured, circling my camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stood up, rifle raised, shouting into the darkness. Asked who was there, told them they were trespassing on occupied campsite. No response, just those footsteps, continuing their circle, always staying in the black spaces between trees. Then they stopped. Complete silence. I waited, muscles locked, sweat running down my back despite the freezing temperature. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. Nothing. The attack came from behind me. I heard the rush of movement and spun around, catching a glimpse of something massive lunging out of the darkness. Antlers, pale skin, eyes burning orange, arms reaching for me with fingers too long and too many joints. I fired on instinct. The rifle blast was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flash turning night to day for a split second. I saw it clearly in that flash. 7 feet tall, humanoid but wrong in every proportion. The antlers weren't growing from a deer skull. They were growing from a human-shaped head, erupting from the temples and forehead like some nightmare fusion of man and animal. The face underneath was stretched and distorted, nose flattened, mouth too wide, filled with teeth that belonged in a predator's jaw. My shot hit its center mass. I heard the bullet impact, heard the thing grunt, but it didn't fall, didn't even stagger. It just stopped its charge, maybe 10 feet from me, and stared. Then it backed away into the darkness, moving with that same unnatural silence. I stood there shaking, rifle still raised, for what felt like hours. The fire had burned down to coals. The cold was seeping through my clothes. My ears rang from the gunshot, but I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare take my eyes off the tree line. When I finally worked up the courage to check the ground where the creature had stood, I found blood. Dark and thick, almost black in my flashlight beam. And tracks. Human-shaped footprints. But larger, deeper, with what looked like claw marks at the toe impressions. I stayed by the fire all night, feeding it constantly, keeping the light high. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like that thing returning. I kept replaying what I'd seen in the muzzle flash, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit it into any rational category. Deformed human, elaborate costume, hallucination. But none of those explanations worked. What I'd seen was real and alive and had tried to grab me. Dawn came slowly. Gray light filtered through the hemlocks, revealing my destroyed campsite. The fire ring was surrounded by tracks, dozens of them, circling my position over and over. The thing had been out there all night, watching, waiting, testing my defenses. I packed my gear with shaking hands and started to hike back to my truck. 2 miles through dense forest, following the trail I demarked on my GPS. Every step felt exposed. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me spin around, rifle ready. The forest felt different in daylight, oppressive and hostile, like the trees themselves were watching me leave. Halfway back, I found the ranger station, a small cabin where Forest Service personnel maintained equipment and met with visitors. I knocked, desperate to talk to another human, to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. A ranger named Sarah Mitchell answered, took one look at my face, and invited me inside. I told her everything, expected her to laugh or call for a psychiatric evaluation. Instead, her expression went carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that comes from hearing something familiar and disturbing. She pulled out a file folder from a locked drawer. Inside were 6 official incident reports, all filed by different rangers over the past 15 years. Each report described encounters with what they called an unidentified presence in the Marionville area. Witnesses reported a tall bipedal figure with antlers, seen at the edges of campsites, heard moving through the forest at night, occasionally approaching humans before retreating. None of the reports used the word monster or creature. They stuck to neutral language. Unidentified presence, unknown entity, possible wildlife anomaly. But reading between the lines, it was clear what they'd seen. The same thing I'd seen. The same thing that had been hunting these woods for decades. Sarah told me the Forest Service had investigated each incident, found tracks, found disturbed campsites, found evidence that something large and bipedal was moving through the forest. But they never captured it, never gotten clear photographs, never found physical remains. And they made a decision not to publicize the encounters. Didn't to want to start a panic or attract cryptid hunters who tear up the forest looking for proof. She asked if I reported the incident to police. I said no. What would I tell them? That a monster attacked my campsite? They'd think I was drunk or crazy. She nodded, understanding, and asked if I planned to hunt in that area again. I told her I wasn't sure I'd hunt in any area again. But here, it's the thing that keeps me awake at night, the detail that transformed this from a terrifying encounter into something worse. Sarah showed me a map of reported sightings going back to the 1960s. Hunters, hikers, park rangers, all describing similar encounters in the same general area. The sightings formed a pattern, a territory about 15 square miles centered on the spot where I decamped. And inside that territory, over the past 60 years, 11 people had gone missing. Experienced outdoorsmen who knew these woods, hunters who never returned from solo trips, hikers who left clear itineraries and then vanished without a trace. Search parties found abandoned camps, sometimes found personal belongings scattered in the forest, but never found bodies. Never found any evidence of what happened to them. The official explanation was accidents, falls, exposure, lost and unable to find their way out. But Sarah's expression told me she didn't believe that. Neither did I not anymore. I drove home that afternoon, rifle and gear still in my truck, promising myself I'd never return to the Allegheny National Forest. For 2 years I kept that promise. Sold my hunting equipment, threw myself into work, tried to forget what I'd seen. But last month, Sarah Mitchell called me. Another hunter had been reported missing in the same area. A man from Ohio, 58 years old, experienced and well-equipped. His truck was found at a trailhead. His camp was found intact. But there was no sign of him. Just tracks around the campsite, human-shaped but wrong, and blood on the ground, dark and thick. Sarah asked if I'd be willing to talk to the search party, to tell them what I'd encountered. I said no. What good would it do? They wouldn't believe me. And even if they did, what could they do against something that has been hunting these mountains for generations? Something that shrugs off rifle shots and moves through the forest like smoke? But I'm telling you now. I'm breaking my silence because I need people to know what is out there. The Marionville Forest Watcher ISN. Folklore. It is not an urban legend or a case of mistaken identity. It's real. It's dangerous. And it's still hunting. If you read planning to camp or hunt in the Allegheny National Forest, especially near Marionville, please reconsider. If you insist on going, never go alone. Keep your fire high all night. And if you see something with antlers standing on 2 legs at the edge of your firelight, try to investigate. Try to photograph it. Pack your gear and leave immediately. Because that thing curious. It shy. It is deciding whether you worth the effort to drag into the deep woods where the search parties will never find what's left of you. I still have nightmares about that night. Still see those orange eyes reflecting my campfire. Still hear those footsteps circling in the darkness. And sometimes, late at night when sleep wants to come, I wonder about the 11 people who went missing in that territory. I wonder if they're still alive somewhere deep in those mountains. I wonder if the Watcher keeps them, uses them, transforms them into something like itself. And I wonder if one day, someone will encounter me at the edge of their campfire, antlers growing from my skull, human enough to be recognized but changed enough to be feared, continuing the cycle that has been going on in those woods for longer than anyone knows.